Rome claimed to be a republic long after it had become something else entirely. Augustus insisted he was just the first citizen, yet he built a system of power more secure and enduring than Caesar's fleeting dictatorship. What Augustus created was authority hidden behind ceremony, a monarchy cloaked in a familiar guise. Many Romans accepted this new order because it brought peace and the comfort of old rituals. But the question remains, how did they live under a monarchy that pretended to be free? To understand, we need to see how that illusion appeared in everyday Rome. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Before we begin, just a quick housekeeping note. If you enjoy what I'm doing, a like and subscribe would be really helpful. It goes a long way in keeping the channel going. And don't forget to drop a comment. I'd really love to know what you think. Imagine walking through Rome and seeing all the symbols of shared rule still intact. Marble steps led citizens up to the Senate. Magistrates strode in their robes of office. Elections were still held. Ballots cast. To the eye, the Republic appeared unbroken. Yet behind these familiar ceremonies, power had narrowed into the hands of one man. This paradox defined the Rome of Augustus. Every ritual continued, but the outcome always aligned with his will. When Augustus took control, he acted with deliberate restraint. Civil wars had exhausted the city, leaving Romans desperate for order. Kingship, however, was a word they loathed, linked with tyranny. So Augustus presented himself differently, not as a monarch, and not even as a dictator like Caesar, but as a servant of the state. His image was that of a statesman restoring everyday life. The sword had brought him to power, but symbols and titles allowed him to maintain his hold. The official framework persisted. Consuls were elected. Magistrates handled cases. The Senate still met. On paper, the Republic had been revived. But if a candidate lacked Augustus's support, their chances quickly diminished. If the Senate passed a decree he opposed, it could be overridden. The old forms remained, yet decision-making depended on one figure who claimed to be no more than princeps, the first citizen. By choosing that label, Augustus suggested he was a leader among equals rather than a ruler above them. That subtle tone mattered. It reassured Romans that tradition remained intact, even as power heavily shifted in his favor. He strengthened this impression by publicly returning authority to the Senate through staged moments called settlements. On the surface, these appeared to be acts of humility, as if he were stepping back from dominance. In fact, each settlement formalized his supremacy more firmly. One granted him permanent control over Rome's most strategic provinces, along with their armies. Another bestowed upon him lifelong tribunician power, the ability to propose laws, convene the Senate, and veto its decisions. Collectively, these measures provided him with a legal basis for a rule that was both stable and presented as constitutional. He avoided the trap that had led Caesar to assassination. He governed by permanence and law, not by temporary dictatorship. At the same time, Augustus restructured the state's machinery to reflect this new order. He downsized and requalified the Senate, making it more manageable and loyal. He created opportunities for the equestrian class in administration by establishing departments to oversee water supply, fire prevention, and transport. Each reform indicated efficiency and renewal, but the more profound impact was clear. Rome now had a bureaucracy focused on one man at the center. Security maintained the system. Augustus commanded the legions across the empire, and closer to home, he established the Praetorian Guard, an elite force of soldiers based in Rome whose loyalty was solely to him. He avoided crowns or robes of royalty. He had no throne, but he kept the soldiers, and in Roman reality, that mattered far more. Peace was achieved after decades of chaos, but everyone understood it depended on armies loyal not to the Senate, but solely to Augustus. This dual structure, the appearance of a republic with the machinery of empire, became the new normal. Citizens participated in voting rituals. Senators debated as before. But crucial levers of power were beyond their reach. The system appeared old, yet it was functioning in an entirely new way. To most people, that was acceptable. Safety returned. The economy flourished. Festivals and traditions still bound communities together, even if their political significance had faded. For ordinary Romans, that trade felt worthwhile. Augustus's success lay in his ability to present autocracy as continuity. He spoke the language of civic duty, surrounded himself with counselors, and avoided the trappings of kingship. For every exceptional privilege he claimed, he dressed it in ordinary clothes. This careful balancing act allowed Rome to believe it still honored its ancestral ways, even as it became something new. By the time his reign matured, the distinction between appearance and reality had become almost meaningless. New generations grew up knowing no world but this one. They still spoke of liberty, held assemblies, and elected consuls. But these rituals had shifted from being sources of power to performances that confirmed Augustus's supremacy. The old republic was not erased. It was hollowed out, filled with structures that secured one man's position while allowing Romans to feel that their traditions endured. That explains why his system endured. People accepted the loss of political independence because it brought peace, stability, and a sense of pride. Augustus had redefined what freedom meant, not the ability to control the state, but the ability to live undisturbed and secure under its protection. He had learned that in Rome, you could rule absolutely as long as you never admitted it openly. As his life advanced, the question was no longer whether the Republic would revive. That illusion had become too ingrained to shift. The question was, what would happen once another effort tried to take hold? Could the same delicate balance of appearances and reality endure when managed by someone less skilled at maintaining both faces? That tension became inevitable when his successor stepped forward, and it revealed what strain lay beneath Rome's new political facade. Tiberius, the second emperor of Rome, found himself leading a system established by Augustus, but he was never entirely comfortable with the role. Whereas Augustus thrived on ceremony and symbols, Tiberius appeared weighed down by them. He stepped into power reluctantly, not with celebration, but with caution. Grand gestures did not mark his rule, but by restraint, a style that set him apart from both his predecessor and the rulers who would follow. From his very first years in power, Tiberius's reluctance was apparent. He avoided spectacles, declined extravagant honors, and regarded the imperial role as a burden rather than a prize. Many expected the new emperor to display triumph and generosity, but Tiberius did the opposite. He reduced festivals and games and refused to indulge in extravagant displays of authority. This disappointed those who longed for the old rhythm of Roman politics, where conquest, ceremony, and celebration united ruler and people. Instead, he created the impression of a caretaker, someone who allowed traditional offices to function while never placing himself too prominently at the center. Despite this reluctance, his government operated effectively. He maintained Augustus's careful balancing act, permitting the Senate to debate, magistrates to govern, and elections to continue. These rituals preserved the facade of the Republic. From an external view, Rome still appeared to be governed by its old structures. Behind the scenes, however, Tiberius held decisive control. He commanded the armies, appointed officials, and decided the fate of provinces. His strength did not rely on public spectacle. It rested on steady management, firm appointments, and the enduring loyalty of the legions. By holding back rather than advancing openly, he allowed Augustus's illusion of a restored republic to persist. Tiberius also inherited the military authority that mattered more than any debate in the Senate. His reputation as a general gave him credibility with soldiers who valued discipline. Their loyalty was tied to him personally, not to senatorial decree. This formed the proper foundation of his power. The Senate might still meet and propose, but the emperor alone commanded the forces. Tiberius did not flaunt this fact. In fact, he chose to keep it as quiet as possible. Yet every senator knew it existed, silent in the background, defining the limits of political life. This reserved approach extended to administration. Tiberius valued competence over charisma and appointed trusted officials to key roles. He selected administrators who were diligent rather than ambitious, men unlikely to provoke flamboyant competition. The result was an efficient but often detached government, more focused on paperwork and discipline than on inspiring the public. It was governance without glamour, which for Rome, a city built on victory parades and spectacles, sometimes felt unsettling. Nevertheless, stability was maintained. He even left a quiet legacy that many overlooked at the time. His frugal rule meant that, by the end of his reign, the treasury was far healthier than the one he inherited. But restraint could also cause frustration. Without triumphs, games, or lavish gifts, many citizens felt overlooked. Senators, too, saw their role shrink into symbolism. They were allowed to speak, but not to decide honestly. The old language of liberty persisted, but everyone understood that ultimate power rested with Tiberius. He insisted on theater. The Senate still functioned, elections still took place, but the balance of power had already shifted. Some praised his modesty, others found it stifling. Either way, his style highlighted a key truth. The mask Augustus had created needed constant attention to survive. This tension was most evident in his interactions with the Senate. Tiberius shifted between respect and suspicion. Sometimes he appeared eager to consult them. Other times, he allowed treason trials and accusations to fill the chamber with fear. These trials, known as delation, prompted citizens to denounce one another, with accusers often profiting from confiscated wealth. It transformed politics into an environment of suspicion, where reputation could be ruined by rumor and whispers. The Senate found itself unable to resist this weapon, and in its subservience, its prestige further diminished. The turning point of his reign occurred when he withdrew from the city. In 27 CE, Tiberius decided to leave Rome and live on the island of Capri. From there, he managed affairs through letters. The Senate, left behind, could do little but await instructions. The very act of governing became reliant on the emperor's personal correspondence. During his absence, one individual rose to fill the vacuum: Sejanus, the Praetorian prefect. Sejanus became the figure through whom power flowed. With the emperor largely absent, he tightened control over Rome using the Praetorian Guard, eliminated rivals through charges of treason, and, for a time, appeared to be on the path to supreme authority himself. The Senate, cowed and complicit, submitted to his moves. Yet the mask of tradition made the deception possible. Sejanus presented himself as a loyal servant while secretly consolidating real influence. His dominance only ended when Tiberius, alerted to the danger, turned against him. Sejanus was denounced and executed in 31 CE. But the crisis revealed something new. The emperor's attempt to govern from a distance had exposed the system's vulnerability. If the ruler stepped back, dangerous intermediaries could step forward. This episode revealed the limits of disguise. The facade of equal governance remained, but it relied entirely on the emperor's ability to manage appearances without withdrawing too much. By hiding too carefully on Capri, Tiberius made it clear that the Senate could not be trusted to govern independently. Worse, his dependence on secret letters and on a prefect to act in his stead showed that power was always personal, not institutional. Men at the center could manipulate it, and men beside the center could abuse it. The final years of his reign intensified this atmosphere of suspicion. Treason charges increased, political careers ended suddenly, and the Senate lost its last traces of independence. Even while avoiding overt displays of monarchy, Tiberius ended up reminding everyone how delicate the disguise was. Republican forms persisted, but they no longer defined the Roman Empire. The emperor's power remained unchallenged, supported not by shared debate, but by the strength of the legions and the silence of fear in the chamber. Tiberius died in 37 CE, leaving behind a stable empire and a Senate that was more weakened than ever. His style of rule had maintained the illusion for over 20 years, but in that very preservation, it revealed its limits. The system relied on appearances. The Senate still had to act as if it mattered. Citizens still had to vote as if elections held significance. Rulers still had to pretend to be nothing more than guardians. Yet, the reality was plain to anyone who looked closely. The theater of tradition persisted only because emperors chose to continue performing it. The question was straightforward, yet perilous. What would occur if an emperor decided not to play along? What if, instead of concealing monarchy, he revealed it? What if the mask that Augustus and Tiberius had meticulously preserved was torn away? But what occurs when an emperor chooses not to conceal his power at all? Caligula's reign began with the promise of renewal, but quickly turned into the most dramatic rupture the Principate had experienced. While Augustus had concealed monarchy behind familiar forms, and Tiberius had cautiously maintained the facade, Caligula abandoned restraint entirely. He showcased power in its most raw and visible form, extravagant, unsettling, and often shocking. Initially, expectations were high. Romans, exhausted by Tiberius's heavy suspicion, greeted the new princeps with relief. Caligula released political prisoners, recalled exiles, and limited the treason trials that had troubled public life. These acts were seen as generous gestures and fostered hope that old liberties might return. For a brief time, people regarded him as a liberator, someone who would eradicate mistrust and restore dignity to civic life. However, this early optimism quickly faded. By the end of his first year, rumors circulated of unchecked appetites and unpredictable commands. Ancient authors often attributed this change to a serious illness, suggesting he never truly recovered. Others hint at vanity, ambition, and suspicion lurking beneath the surface. Whatever the cause, the result was unmistakable. The impression of a benevolent ruler dissolved, and Rome faced an emperor who outright dismissed the masks of tradition. He made his influence felt most sharply in religion, where restraint had been part of Augustus's careful balancing act. Caligula, by contrast, pushed imperiously into divine space. He adopted forms of personal worship, planned shrines, and thrust his image into sacred contexts. Most provocatively, he reportedly ordered his statue to be placed in the Jewish temple at Jerusalem, an act that would have broken fundamental religious law. Only the intervention of Herod Agrippa convinced him to revoke the decree. Even so, the order revealed both his political recklessness and his willingness to stretch imperial dignity to the point of divinity itself. This shift shattered the very illusion of shared governance. Augustus had spoken as first among equals. Tiberius had framed his commands within senatorial procedures. But Caligula demanded recognition not as a citizen or even princeps, but as a god. For the Senate, this was an intolerable humiliation. They had already seen their power shrink. Now even the pretense of mutual respect was being stripped away. His open contempt for senatorial dignity and public ritual exposed the fragility of the Principate when an emperor ceased to pretend. Beyond acts of worship, his involvement in public entertainments further destabilized Rome's sense of order. Earlier emperors had sponsored games, but remained aloof, positioning themselves as guardians of Roman traditions rather than participants. Caligula disregarded that approach. He played roles in performances, mingled with gladiators, and allowed himself to be seen not as an arbiter, but as a spectacle. To Roman eyes, this blurred essential boundaries. The emperor was no longer elevated. He was performing for applause, and with each display, imperial majesty was reduced to theater. His approach to governance intensified this sense of collapse. Treason trials, which he had initially abolished, returned with renewed force. Senators and wealthy men were charged. Some were driven to suicide, others executed outright. These acts were less about law and more about fear. Arbitrary decrees and sudden reversals left the Senate paralyzed. They still gathered, still voted, still applauded, but no one doubted that real decisions were entirely at the emperor's whim. One episode exemplified his capricious detachment. Ancient sources describe how he led his legions to the northern shore of Gaul, declaring a campaign against the ocean. At his signal, they gathered seashells as trophies of war. The historicity of this event is debated. Our sources are hostile, and details may be exaggerated, but the story persisted because it demonstrated how absurdly military order could be manipulated for imperial spectacle. Rome's most significant power, its disciplined legions, had been reduced to players in a farce. By this point, the illusion so crucial to the Principate had shattered. Augustus had united senators and citizens through gestures of continuity, presenting monarchy dressed in the guise of the Republic. Tiberius had managed the system carefully, maintaining both dignity and stability. But Caligula treated every tradition as a plaything. The Senate, once a nominal partner, now existed merely as a target and audience. His own conduct told Rome not to bother pretending. Authority belonged solely to him, unmasked, unfettered, unchecked. The strain became unbearable. Senators resented his taunts. Citizens grew frustrated at witnessing their institutions mocked. More dangerously, the Praetorian Guard, the soldiers responsible for protecting him, began to see the emperor not as a unifying figure, but as a liability. This tension reached a breaking point in 41 CE, when members of the Guard assassinated him in the heart of Rome. His death occurred not at the behest of the Senate or the people, but from the men whose loyalty was crucial for any emperor's survival. His demise delivered a harsh lesson. Power in the Principate depended not on debates or traditions, but on soldiers and their support for the ruler. As long as emperors maintained appearances, the elite accepted their diminished roles. Remove those facades, and the fiction unraveled into resentment and conspiracy. His assassination highlighted how fragile the system was, and how much it hinged on not just force, but on preserving the illusion of continuity. Caligula's brief and violent reign thus marked a turning point. He illustrated what happens when the emperor abandons the mask. Spectacle, arrogance, and disdain for institutions exposed the core of monarchy, and by stripping it of its veneer, he nearly brought the Principate crashing down. Yet, his downfall also served as a reminder to Rome of the importance of the mask. Tradition and ceremony might have been superficial, but they were essential. Without them, nothing protected the emperor from the fury of the elite or the army. In the aftermath, his successor emerged, a figure unexpected, overlooked, and initially ridiculed. However, in that modest figure lay the opportunity to restore the shattered image of order, not through grandeur, but through administrative effort that touched every part of the empire. And Rome, battered by the spectacle of Caligula, was prepared to accept a man who would stabilize the machinery rather than seek the limelight. From behind the curtain of palace politics, one of Rome's most unlikely rulers emerged, a man remembered not for grandeur, but for administration. Claudius, often overlooked by his family because of his limp and stammer, became emperor almost by chance after Caligula's assassination. Yet, where others might have faltered, Claudius defined his reign by introducing something new. He stabilized the empire by professionalizing its machinery, rather than by restoring the Senate's power. For Claudius, the state's survival depended less on republican ritual and more on whether aqueducts flowed, granaries remained full, borders stayed secure, and roads stayed open. This shift in focus altered the balance of power in politics. The Senate maintained its prestige, but Claudius believed true strength came from a system that operated efficiently across vast provinces. Therefore, he increasingly directed daily governance into clear channels of administration rather than empty debates. A key aspect of this shift was his reliance on freedmen, trusted formerly enslaved people promoted to senior roles. Claudius appointed them to oversee grain supplies, finance, correspondence, and water systems. Because these men had no background in the Senate, they lacked aristocratic ambitions. They were loyal only to him. This established a professional, reliable civil service that spanned the empire. However, it also caused resentment among senators, who saw their authority diminish to mere ceremony, while freedmen held practical power. Claudius also revived the office of censor, through which he tightened control over who could sit in the Senate. He removed members he judged inadequate, and even abolished senatorial roles that overlapped with his new administrative boards. For senators, this was disrespectful. Offices traditionally held with dignity were either abolished or overshadowed by imperial clerks. For Claudius, however, it was simply a matter of efficiency. Each reform concentrated authority more clearly under imperial oversight, reducing gaps or overlaps. Beyond the city of Rome, Claudius continued one of Augustus's most vital policies, extending citizenship. Entire communities in Gaul and the Alps were granted Roman citizenship, allowing their elites to run for offices traditionally reserved for Roman citizens. This meant foreign chiefs could even become quaestors, directly entering the senatorial hierarchy. To Claudius, this demonstrated that Rome's greatness lay in its ability to embrace outsiders. But to conservative Italian senators, It felt like a loss of exclusivity. Men from families who had once fought Gauls now sat alongside them in the chamber. The old aristocracy's monopoly was forever weakened. Expansion through conquest added to this transformation. Rome already stretched from Spain to Syria, but Claudius ensured it continued to expand its territory. He annexed Mauritania in North Africa after a revolt, Lycia in Asia Minor, and Thrace in the Balkans. Yet, his most significant achievement came in 43 CE when Roman troops crossed into Britain. In that year, he launched the invasion and established a Roman province there, an act that boosted his legitimacy. Claudius even traveled briefly to the island to receive the surrender. On his return to Rome, he was awarded a triumph and the title Britannicus, which was later bestowed upon his son. Campaigns like this gained public prestige while reinforcing stability at home. Military command was entrusted to loyal generals. Claudius avoided appointing ambitious aristocrats who might turn victories into rival power bases. His approach was pragmatic. Let professionals expand the empire, but ensure glory returned solely to the emperor. Once again, senators grumbled over missed opportunities, yet the military remained steady, and citizens benefited from new resources under Roman control. At the same time, Claudius invested in infrastructure. He sponsored new aqueducts and improved harbors to secure grain shipments into the capital. Departments were established to oversee fire prevention, postal services, roads, and the critical water supply. Taxes were standardized across provinces, simplifying administration and strengthening fiscal oversight. Grain supply management became more disciplined, reassuring citizens that the city would not suffer starvation. This was governance as practical engineering, where the emperor behaved less like a symbolic figurehead and more like a director, ensuring all parts of a vast machine operated smoothly. Think of it as a family workshop that has grown into a large company. Early traditions still echo, but with growth, success now depends on managers, records, and defined departments. Claudius made Rome operate in this way, less on noble birth, more on competent administration. He was, in effect, the empire's chief executive. The cost of this order was the Senate's decline. The body still held sessions, still voted, and still issued decrees. But the work of governance had nearly entirely shifted into the emperor's domain. Claudius's freedmen issued orders with more influence than any senatorial debate. For the general populace, this arrangement brought stability. For the aristocracy, it was frustrating. They maintained their status, but not their power. Tensions increased further when Claudius, using his censorial office, admitted provincial elites from Gaul into the Senate itself. This move symbolized his vision of Rome, not as the privilege of Italians, but as an empire of many peoples sharing citizenship and responsibilities. He argued it was the engine of Roman greatness, but to many senators, it was shocking and insulting. The chamber that once represented ancient Italian families now included outsiders long considered enemies. Despite his administrative successes, ancient historians often wrote grimly of Claudius. His limp and speech impediment made him a target for ridicule. His reliance on freedmen fostered contempt. Conservative writers accused him of surrendering noble dignity. Yet the evidence of his reign is clear. He expanded territories, secured the capital with ample supplies, built effective structures of government, and left the state with healthier finances. These achievements were measured less in spectacle and more in tangible results. Augustus concealed the monarchy under a gentle veil of tradition. Tiberius maintained the illusion through caution. Caligula tore it apart with reckless showmanship. Claudius institutionalized the monarchy through systems, encompassing paperwork, census rolls, financial reforms, and provincial administrations. Everyone saw the truth. Senators still wore their togas and performed rituals. Assemblies still gathered, but their influence waned. This era marked a shift. The empire no longer needed to hide the monarchy so carefully. Claudius believed his legitimacy stemmed not from pretending to share power, but from demonstrating that Rome thrived under his rule. Roads were kept in repair, aqueducts operated, Britain became a province, grain reached the capital, and revenues flowed in. Citizens felt secure and prosperous, and for the emperor, that sufficed. By the end of his reign, the gap between appearance and reality was more pronounced than ever. The Republican mask still covered the surface, but inside, the empire functioned as an efficient autocracy. The machinery worked because Claudius rebuilt it with purpose, not for show. It was a genuine departure from older illusions. Government was run by the emperor through loyal staff and effective systems, not through aristocratic debate. Yet while Claudius favored machinery and efficiency, his successor adopted a very different attitude to power. Order and administration gave way to spectacle and performance. In the next chapter, imperial politics was about to step out from offices and onto the stage. A new ruler would treat the throne itself as a platform for change. When Nero came to power in 54 CE, Rome expected continuity, perhaps even a renewal of the administrative focus established by Claudius. Instead, it gained an emperor whose reign would become synonymous with spectacle and ruin. Unlike his predecessors, Nero allowed theater, literally and figuratively, to define his rule. Initially, however, there was reason for hope. Nero was only a teenager, but around him stood capable figures: Seneca the Younger, his tutor and advisor, and Burrus, the head of the Praetorian Guard. Guided by their counsel, his first years showed competence. Laws were applied fairly, taxes were eased, and governance appeared steady. Later generations even looked back on this phase and referred to it as the 5 good years of Nero. But as soon as Burrus died in 62 CE and Seneca withdrew from public life, the mask fell away. Nero's interest in administration waned, and his fascination with art, spectacle, and self-indulgence came to dominate. Freed from restraint, he poured energy into reciting poetry, competing in music, and taking to the stage with a lyre in hand. He fancied himself a charioteer, racing before crowds and insisting on performing publicly. For an emperor to become an entertainer was unprecedented, and for the Roman elite, unthinkable. In their eyes, actors ranked among the lowest professions. When the ruler of the empire assumed that role, scandal ensued. Dignity crumbled. To the Senate, this was disgraceful. But to ordinary citizens, the sight of their emperor singing, acting, or racing held fascination. They cheered, and Nero fed on that reaction. The more applause he received, the more his reign shifted from governance to performance. This widening gap between popular and elite opinion became the fault line of his regime. Citizens loved the games, shows, and festivals he sponsored, but senators saw the dignity of the state stripped away. Worse still, while Nero busied himself with contests and applause, he neglected matters of empire. Reports from governors were brushed aside. The delicate balance Augustus had created between illusion of shared rule and reality of control collapsed when Nero openly refused to play the part of the first citizen. The turning point came in 64 CE. A fire broke out and raged across the city for days, consuming whole districts. Thousands were left homeless as temples, homes, and shops turned to ash. Ancient authors disagreed on whether Nero played any role in starting the fire. Some believed him responsible, while others credited his efforts to provide relief. He did open gardens, aqueducts, and shelters for the displaced. But he also used the aftermath to launch his most extravagant project, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, built across the very center of Rome, on land cleared by the flames. The scale of the palace, with its artificial lake, gilded halls, and sweeping views, appeared as a grotesque contrast to the misery of citizens who had lost everything. Suspicion hardened. Relief efforts were overshadowed by the palace that rose from the ruins. To deflect blame, Nero turned attention elsewhere. He chose a small, marginal group, the Christians of Rome. Their refusal to honor Rome's gods already drew distrust. Now Nero accused them of starting the fire. Arrests and brutal punishments followed. Victims were executed in public, and sometimes used as human torches during games. This episode stands as the first recorded systematic persecution of Christians by a Roman emperor. It satisfied Rome's call for vengeance, but it also revealed the emperor's reliance on spectacle and cruelty to preserve himself. While Rome burned and rebuilt, foreign policy had its own dramas. In the east, Rome fought Parthia for dominance over Armenia. Though the war nearly ended in disaster for Rome, General Corbulo turned the tide. The settlement forced Parthian rulers to acknowledge Rome's oversight of Armenia for generations. But Nero's part was minimal, and fear soon overshadowed this success. Distrusting the loyalty of strong generals, Nero compelled Corbulo in 67 CE to commit suicide, a shocking end for a man celebrated as the savior of Roman arms. The act alarmed officers and eroded the army's faith in the emperor. Meanwhile, provinces erupted. In Britain, Queen Boudica led a widespread revolt in 60 or 61 CE. Towns were burned, Roman citizens massacred, before force eventually quelled the rebellion. In Judea, religious and social tensions turned into a prolonged revolt from 66 CE onward, draining legion after legion and threatening Rome's grip on the region. Both uprisings highlighted imperial neglect, which was exacerbated by Nero's extravagant spending. Taxes rose steeply to fund his lifestyle and building projects, breeding further resentment in the provinces. In Rome itself, opposition crystallized in 65 CE with the Piso conspiracy, a widespread plot among senators, equestrians, and even members of the imperial household. It aimed to replace Nero with a senator named Gaius Calpurnius Piso. Discovered before it could strike, the conspiracy ended in a massacre of Rome's elite. Nero sanctioned mass executions. Piso, Seneca, and many others died. Terror spread. The Senate was paralyzed by fear, while the emperor's paranoia deepened. Nero then sought validation elsewhere. In 66 CE, he embarked on a grand journey to Greece. There, he appeared in contests of music and athletics, adopting Greek robes and airs of a cultural visionary. In his eyes, this was imperial expansion into the realm of the arts. But in the eyes of senators left behind in Rome, it was abandonment. While Nero basked in applause on Greek stages, the empire trembled with revolt and financial strain. The reality was unmistakable. The emperor had turned governance into a theater and neglected the engine of the state. Think of it as a wall painted over with brilliant colors. At first glance, everything dazzled, but beneath, cracks widened. The paint, however vivid, could not prevent collapse. Nero layered Rome with pageantry and palaces, but none of it could reinforce the decaying structure beneath. By 68 CE, fractures broke open. Governors in Spain and Gaul refused to recognize him. Armies in the provinces, once his backbone, transferred loyalty to new leaders. His misrule had alienated elites, depleted the treasury, and eroded military trust. Without soldiers, no emperor could survive. Nero fled, abandoned even by his Praetorian Guard. Surrounded by no supporters, he took his own life. The Julio-Claudian dynasty ended with him. His death exposed the illusion at the center of his rule. Applause could not replace authority. Theater was no substitute for loyalty. Nero had sought to rule as performer rather than statesman. But when the clapping stopped, nothing held his regime together. What followed made the lesson plain. Provinces rebelled, armies fought, and power shifted in rapid succession. Within a single year, 4 emperors would rise and fall, not chosen by the Senate, but by the legions who held the swords. Rome was about to face a stark reckoning with where authority truly lay. In 69 CE, Rome faced a crisis unlike any it had experienced before. 4 different emperors rose and fell within a single year. This year of the 4 emperors laid bare the true nature of power. No pretense of republican ritual could mask the reality that commanders with loyal soldiers could make or unmake an emperor. The sequence began with Galba. Elevated after Nero's suicide, he was welcomed in Rome as a restorer of order. But discipline and frugality defined his rule, and these very traits proved fatal. He angered the Praetorian Guard by refusing the rewards they expected, cut spending in ways that hurt soldiers and allies, and then alienated Otho by choosing another man as heir. Otho turned directly to the Guard, offering the riches Galba denied. The Praetorians switched sides, killed Galba in the Forum, and proclaimed Otho emperor. Already it was clear, legitimacy lay with the soldiers, not with the Senate. Otho's reign was short. His authority relied solely on the swords of the Guard, and even they could not protect him from rivals abroad. In the Rhine provinces, legions declared their commander, Vitellius, emperor. This demonstrated how much power had shifted. Men outside Italy could elevate their leader without reference to Rome. As Otho advanced north and Vitellius's troops moved south, the First Battle of Bedriacum settled the issue. Otho's army was defeated, and rather than face shame, he took his own life. His suicide shocked Rome, but it affirmed the new reality. It was the battlefield, not debate, that crowned or killed an emperor. Vitellius then entered Rome victorious, accompanied by loyal soldiers. At first, he sought recognition from both the people and the Senate. However, he soon developed a reputation for indulgence and cruelty, while new legions in the east supported another candidate, Vespasian. Tacitus later observed that the situation was unmistakable. It was now possible for an emperor to be chosen outside Rome. When armies in Judea, Syria, and Egypt proclaimed Vespasian, they demonstrated to the Senate that it was merely recording the outcome. Vitellius, unable to compete with Eastern strength, held power only for as long as rivals had not yet arrived. The Second Battle of Bedriacum sealed his fate. Vespasian's supporters in Italy defeated Vitellius's forces, and after a brief resistance in the capital, he was dragged through Rome and killed. His fall was brutal, but the truth was simple. Whoever commanded the victorious legions became emperor. The Senate's role was secondary, delivering ceremonial approval after all decisions had already been made in the field. Finally, Vespasian, declared by Eastern legions and sustained through victory in war, he entered Rome not as the Senate's nominee, but as the soldier's choice. His strength derived from the fact that soldiers from provinces in Italy recognized him as a leader. His legitimacy did not require elaborate disguises. He succeeded where Galba, Otho, and Vitellius had failed because his claim was based on superior armies and discipline, combined with the promise of stability after chaos. This year revealed what Augustus's careful rhetoric and Claudius's bureaucracy had kept hidden. No illusions persisted. The decisive factor was not descent, title, or ritual, but loyalty of the legions. Each emperor of 69 CE rose at the command of armies and fell once he abandoned that command. The two battles at Bedriacum were not mere clashes, they were contests by combat, where the outcome of civil war shaped Rome's constitution with swords. The Senate remained active, engaging in discussions, voting, and confirming appointments. But everyone knew its decrees were little more than echoes. The entire political spectacle, the togas, the titles, the ancestral rituals, had been swept away in the smoke of burnt cities and the clash of provincial legionaries. One line summed it up. Emperors were no longer chosen in Rome. They were forged on the frontiers and carried to power by marching columns. Consider it as a stage where the painted backdrop has finally fallen. For decades, the audience could pretend, applauding a performance that disguised monarchy in republican attire. But in 69 CE, the curtain dropped, revealing only soldiers in armor. From that moment on, the mask was removed. And yet, from the chaos, Vespasian offered Rome something it desperately needed: stability. He proved his claim through force, but he secured it with order. Once in power, he moved away from spectacle and began to reshape Rome materially and financially. The empire did not return to the facade of shared rule. It embraced the clarity of military monarchy. What followed was an emperor who understood that after turmoil, people needed proof of endurance, proof built in laws, stones, and monuments. Vespasian came to power eager to demonstrate that Rome's strength could be visibly and tangibly rebuilt. After a year of civil war and unsuccessful rulers, he made it clear from the beginning that his reign would focus on practical repairs rather than empty gestures. What mattered now were finances, administration, and monuments that all Romans could see and share. His first challenge was financial. Nero's extravagance, followed by civil wars, had nearly drained the treasury. Vespasian, a disciplined soldier, managed the empire's finances as strictly as a general manages supply lines. He raised provincial taxes, reclaimed public land that had been illegally held in Italy, and increased oversight of revenue. He revoked some tax exemptions granted to Greek-speaking cities and redirected the temple tax once paid by Jews across the empire into Rome's treasury. These actions drew complaints, and critics accused him of greed. But beyond the criticism, the funds enabled the rebuilding of Rome's key institutions and public life. Yet revenue alone did not guarantee loyalty. Vespasian realized that those paying taxes needed to see returns in visible, lasting ways. Instead of feasts or spectacles of waste, he offered permanent works. He began construction of the Temple of Peace, which carried immediate symbolism after years of upheaval. He restored the Capitoline Hill, scarred in recent fighting, reasserting continuity with Rome's most sacred past. Above all, he initiated the largest amphitheater Rome had ever seen, the Colosseum. Vespasian built the amphitheater on land cleared after Nero's Domus Aurea, turning private luxury back into public space. What had once been a pleasure palace reserved for one man now became a stadium seating tens of thousands. This simple act showed citizens that the empire belonged, at least in appearance, to them again. The placement and purpose of these buildings achieved three goals. They enhanced the city's infrastructure for worship, gathering, and entertainment. They cemented the Flavian dynasty in stone, ensuring that long after Vespasian's death, his name remained linked to Rome's great monuments. They also demonstrated that taxes channeled upward were redirected into projects visible to the people. Every prayer in the Temple of Peace, every competition in the Colosseum, reminded citizens who had funded these structures. For a ruler without an Augustan pedigree, stone was the strongest argument for legitimacy. However, reform extended beyond bricks. Vespasian turned to administration, which had long been neglected or corrupted under his predecessors. He believed the Senate was unable to guide the empire effectively. Politics could still be conducted within its chambers, but decisions would be made elsewhere. He strengthened the equestrian order by appointing equites, traditionally men of business or local governance, to new roles: treasuries, administrative offices, provincial governorships, and even legions. This approach ensured efficient management and provided loyal servants whose promotion depended on imperial favor. One clear sign of this was when equestrians were appointed to oversee the outstanding treasuries, bypassing the Senate's claims of privilege. Aristocrats resented the loss of influence, but governors and soldiers now responded more directly to the emperor through his appointed officials. This shift towards equestrian officials also reshaped social ambition. Senators, still clothed in old traditions, found themselves limited to ritual and prestige. They debated and voted, but their decisions mattered little compared to the emperor's council staffed by equestrians and trusted advisors. The illusion of shared governance remained, but the empire's affairs were now conducted by men chosen for efficiency rather than pedigree. The Senate, once the stage of politics, became a backdrop while the administration moved into imperial offices. Loyalty of the legions also needed repair. The civil wars had shown how quickly armies could switch allegiance, toppling emperors in a matter of days. Vespasian tightened discipline, ensuring soldiers remembered that their loyalty lay with Rome's ruler, not ambitious generals. Auxiliaries recruited from provinces were posted away from their homelands to prevent rebellion. Command of units was given to Roman officers directly answerable to the emperor. This restored order and diminished the dangerous precedent of troops proclaiming their leaders. By the end of his reign, the empire's military system had regained coherence, making a repeat of 69 CE less likely. Foreign policy under Vespasian avoided costly wars of expansion. His focus was on consolidation. In Judea, the rebellion triggered under Nero was crushed by his son Titus, culminating in Jerusalem's fall and the destruction of its temple. In the north, he moved the frontiers slightly forward in Germany, but his goal was defense, not reckless conquest. By entrusting military tasks to family and loyal generals, he emphasized that Rome's concern was order, not glory. Vespasian himself was not from Rome's ancient patrician lines, but from an Italian municipal background. Around him gathered a new elite of others like him, practical, sober, not adorned with old family pretensions, but steady in service. This second tier of the aristocracy, comprising Italian citizens and equestrian administrators, laid the foundation for Rome's 2nd century. Unlike the flamboyant Julio-Claudian court, these men were more focused on accounts, regulation, and order. In their work lay the quiet origins of what later would be remembered as Rome's golden age of administration. These choices redefined imperial legitimacy. Augustus relied on ancestry and the illusion of republican ritual. Later emperors, for better or worse, engaged in theatrical displays or claimed divinity. Vespasian signaled a different foundation. He ruled more openly. His claim to legitimacy was based on maintaining order and providing visible public benefits rather than carefully preserving republican language. His message was simple. Rome functioned because he ensured it did. Although some whispering critics satirized his blunt fiscal measures, ordinary citizens most often saw the amphitheater, temples, aqueducts, and coins stamped with the word pax, peace, reminding them who had replaced chaos with stability. The coins, in fact, communicated volumes, whereas past emperors promoted divine ancestry or personal triumph. Vespasian issued currency bearing everyday assurances: civil peace, security, stability. Every Roman's coin conveyed a message that his reign had ended disruption. Money was propaganda in metal, and Vespasian struck no uncertain tones. Historians later described him as unlike most emperors because he improved in office rather than declined. That impression stemmed from his moderation. He could be ruthless in eliminating threats, yet tolerant of those who posed no harm. His humor and renowned frugality softened an image otherwise sharpened by relentless taxation. To many, he appeared the embodiment of a ruler who balanced authority with pragmatism, recognizing the limits of grandeur and preferring things that endured. Of course, the burdens were not light everywhere. Provinces, especially in the east, felt the increased weight of taxation. After Jerusalem's fall, Jews across the empire were forced to send their temple tax not to their sanctuary, but to Rome, a bitter reminder of defeat. Resources steadily flowed to the capital, and provincial discontent simmered beneath the surface. Pragmatism in the city could feel like domination in the provinces. Still, the contrast with Nero's ruin and the chaos of civil war was stark. Citizens no longer feared disorder or watched as emperors rose and fell in weeks. Administration, soldiering, and building had settled Rome into a predictable rhythm. The Flavian dynasty secured its position not by invoking Augustus's ghost or boasting divine ties, but by anchoring its presence in everyday essentials: water, bread, amphitheaters, and coinage. Tradition still lingered. The Senate met. Magistrates wore robes. But these rituals were relics of a system no one believed in any longer. By the time Vespasian died in 79 CE, Rome had accepted the plain truth. Its ruler was not a partner or a citizen among equals, but a monarch who maintained the empire's stability. The illusion of shared government existed only as a ceremony. Legitimacy came through order made visible in stone and steel. His son and successor would use these tools in a very different, more demanding way. What followed was a ruler who no longer tried to soften or disguise the reality of imperial power. With Domitian, the last emperor of the Flavian dynasty, the age of pretense gave way to open monarchy. He did not present himself as a first citizen among peers, nor as a partner with the Senate. Instead, he demanded recognition as Rome's sole and absolute master. From the beginning of his reign, he emphasized that message. While Augustus and even Vespasian appeared in plain togas before senators, Domitian entered their chamber in triumphal dress. He called himself Dominus et Deus, Master and God, a form of address that astonished the populace and shocked the senatorial class. While earlier emperors relied on subtle language to maintain ritual partnerships, Domitian rendered such partnerships obsolete. He wanted Rome to see him not as custodian of tradition, but as the embodiment of command. His official roles confirmed this approach. In 85 CE, he assumed the censorship for life, a power that allowed him to decide who sat in the Senate and how they were judged. No previous emperor had dared to hold this magistracy permanently. By doing so, Domitian left senators with no autonomy, even in name. At the same time, he claimed the consulship almost every year from 82 to 88 CE, monopolizing an office once meant to rotate as a mark of civic dignity. Earlier, rulers had distributed honors among aristocrats to preserve appearances, but Domitian concentrated them in himself, declaring by action that appearances no longer mattered. The administration followed a similar pattern. Like Claudius, he expanded the role of equites, the equestrian order, in imperial offices. Equestrians, men outside the Senate, were increasingly appointed to positions that senators once valued, from provincial administration to roles on the imperial council itself. This approach was efficient, but politically provocative. For centuries, the Senate had claimed governance as its heritage. Domitian handed those powers to others, demonstrating to senators that their birth did not grant them any privilege he chose not to bestow. To senators, this wasn't very respectful. They had tolerated emperors who restrained them while maintaining ceremony, or who punished them harshly but kept a facade of dignity. Domitian dismissed the pretense and ruled openly without their input. Inevitably, bitterness turned into hostility, and when hostility emerged, Domitian responded with intimidation. Charges of treason, the law of maiestas, once again became a weapon. Accusations of conspiracy or disloyalty led to trials, executions, and confiscations. The results filled his treasury and silenced opposition, but they also created a climate of fear that poisoned political life. Between 93 and 96 CE, the prosecutions grew frequent enough to be remembered as years of terror. The execution of his cousin, Flavius Clemens, a man of consular rank, shocked Rome. If kin could fall, no senator felt secure. The courtroom became a theater where the verdict was predetermined, and only professions of loyalty could temporarily spare a life. Even as fear loomed over the aristocracy, Domitian continued with noticeable public works. He commissioned a new forum in his name, expanded palaces, and preserved Rome's grandeur. He raised military pay, securing the loyalty of the legions, and led campaigns on the frontier. These measures boosted his support among soldiers and citizens. Yet for the Senate, they were accompanied by property seizures and heavy taxes, leading them to believe they were paying not for the country's well-being, but for their own domination. Public displays meant one thing to the crowd, another entirely to the ruling class. Domitian's style of rule celebrated ritual and performance, but not as older emperors had used them. Instead of binding society together with illusion, he used ceremony as a stage for his supremacy. Festivals multiplied, games centered on his presence, and every civic gesture pointed to himself as the sole source of authority. Symbols that once softened monarchy became instruments to harden it. To senators forced to cheer, these were not assurances. They were humiliations played out in public. The resentment that grew festered into conspiracy. Domitian had alienated large sections of Rome's ruling elite, and even his closest household no longer trusted his protection. In September 96 CE, the betrayal arose from within. His own palace officials, praetorian prefects, and even his wife Domitia took part in his assassination. The event demonstrated how fragile his reliance on terror had become. Without shared legitimacy or willing allies among the elite, even a powerful emperor remained vulnerable. An emperor who sought to govern entirely alone ultimately learned that he could not. The Senate responded with a clear gesture. They condemned his memory through damnatio memoriae, tearing down statues, erasing inscriptions, and attempting to blot the man from Rome's history. However, obliterating his image could not erase what he had demonstrated. His reign revealed the truth that monarchy no longer required any pretense of shared governance. He ruled without the solemnity of partnership, replaced by a regime of command. His death served as a reminder to Rome that although appearances could be discarded, doing so was dangerous. The elite, stripped of their dignity, would bide their time until the chance to strike back arose. The army's reaction contrasted sharply with the Senate's fury. Many soldiers stayed loyal to Domitian, demanded punishing his assassins, and mourned him as their commander. That divide was revealing. The emperor's bond with the army was strong, ensuring their pay and security. In contrast, his relationship with the Senate had been nothing but disdain. Rome now had two audiences watching the same ruler: soldiers respecting him, senators despising him, and citizens caught between forced reverence and fear. With his murder, the Flavian line ended. Into the vacuum stepped Nerva, chosen as a compromise figure to reassure elites and prevent military backlash. He represented the Senate's chance, at least in appearance, to restore dignity. But that dignity was only superficial. In reality, the armies still decided who truly held the throne, and the emperor still controlled the machinery of governance. The illusion briefly re-established itself as senators regained ceremonial importance, yet the balance of power remained exactly as Domitian had revealed. The significance of his reign was simple, yet profound. Domitian compelled everyone to accept that the monarchy was no longer disguised. He demanded divine titles, monopolized offices, and ruled without even symbolic authority. His assassination revealed that naked power was risky, but it also demonstrated that the old tradition's mask had lost all real influence. Later emperors might restore its trappings or allow the Senate to play its part again. However, after Domitian, no one could believe that the disguise was anything more than a decorative element. Think of it as a painted stage backdrop finally torn away. Successors might hang it back up, but the audience had seen the stone wall behind. The contrast was striking. Domitian's reign marked the end of pretense in Roman imperial life. Emperors could still use old words and ceremonies, but everyone understood where actual authority rested. From that point, Rome entered a new century of rule. The Republic was remembered only in name, with its roles performed without substance. The emperor had become the state, and public life openly revolved around his person. It was in this reality that the subsequent rulers stepped forward, figures who no longer needed to hide or apologize because their authority had become indistinguishable from Rome itself. By the 2nd century, Rome's identity was no longer based on illusion. Authority stood clearly at the center, carried by the emperor himself. This was the age of Trajan and Hadrian, two rulers whose very different styles revealed one truth: the emperor now embodied the empire. Trajan came first. Adopted by Nerva, he was a soldier known for his discipline and leadership. His reign from 98 to 117 CE marked the peak of Roman expansion. The most celebrated moment was his conquest of Dacia, achieved through 2 tough campaigns beyond the Danube. That victory was not just symbolic. Dacia's rich mines brought new revenue into the treasury, strengthening Rome's finances after decades of strain. Citizens saw real benefit: new wealth funding public works, games, and distributions. To mark the triumph, Trajan built his Forum and the still towering Trajan's Column. With its spiraling reliefs depicting the campaigns in stone for everyone to see. The message was clear. Augustus had once been cautious about monarchy with modest titles. Trajan did not. As Optimus Princeps, Rome's best ruler, he was openly praised as conqueror, provider, and master. Beyond Dacia, he expanded east, bringing Arabia, Armenia, and even parts of Mesopotamia under control, briefly pushing Rome to its furthest territorial extent. Conquest brought glory, but also hardship. Armies stretched further into hostile land, and supply lines became strained. Trajan died still campaigning in the east, leaving questions about whether his pursuit of endless victories had gone beyond what the empire could sustain. Hadrian, his adopted heir, addressed those doubts by choosing a different path. After succeeding in 117 CE, he abandoned distant ambitions in Mesopotamia and focused on consolidating the empire. For him, Rome's greatness was not in constant expansion, but in safeguarding its borders. This was most evident in Britain, where he ordered the construction of Hadrian's Wall, a frontier stretching across the island, marking the boundary Rome aimed to defend. It served both as a defense and a statement. Here, Rome rules. Beyond this line, it does not. What distinguished Hadrian was not only his policies, but also his presence. He became the first emperor to travel extensively, moving through Gaul, Germania, Greece, Egypt, and beyond. In each province, he inspected troops, reviewed defenses, and supported towns. Rather than being a distant ruler whose authority was felt only through officials and decrees, Hadrian appeared personally. Citizens saw their emperor directly. Soldiers were reviewed face to face. Provinces were connected through his footsteps. Like Trajan, Hadrian also left monuments. In Athens, he constructed new temples. In Asia, he redeveloped cities. And across the empire, his building projects bore his mark. But while Trajan's monuments celebrated military victories, Hadrian's works praised cultural integration and stability. He admired Greek traditions and intentionally incorporated them into the fabric of the empire. This emperor portrayed himself not only as Rome's guardian, but also as a supporter of its diverse cultures. By Hadrian's era, there was no cloak left to hide behind. The emperor wore the empire itself, as if every road, fortress, and monument was a thread in a cloak draped across his shoulders. The Senate still convened, elections still took place, and ceremonies still honored Rome's ancient customs. But they no longer influenced policy. When Trajan launched new wars, it reshaped Rome's borders. When Hadrian chose to consolidate, he defined the empire's boundaries. One man's decision set the course for millions. Together, the two emperors embodied the full scope of imperial power. Trajan expanded and conquered, symbolizing Rome's pursuit of glory. Hadrian consolidated territories and traveled, representing Rome's endurance and expansive reach. In both cases, legitimacy was no longer based on illusion, but on the emperor's personal presence, celebrated through stone monuments, walls, roads, and the lives shaped by his decisions. During their era, the Republic's institutions persisted only as ceremonial remnants. Actual authority resided where all could see it, in the ruler at the center, embodying both the symbol and the reality of Rome. This reality taught Romans what stability required, and why sometimes illusions mattered less than the power they concealed. Romans lived under a monarchy disguised as freedom, and this disguise persisted for centuries. People accepted the superficial traditions, Senate meetings, elections, magistrates, because grain ships still arrived and peace still prevailed. The illusion provided dignity, even when real power was exercised elsewhere. What is notable is that appearances mattered as much as armies. The Roman story poses a question you can consider in your own time. How much of power is visible, and how much is accepted